Well, this is the Corin helmet after Stan Corin, who built it. It was based upon a design where we figured that the most effective way to influence the brain is very weak magnetic fields that work at the level of consciousness, the electromagnetic fields associated with consciousness, which are very, very weak. And so consequently, these different solenoids generate little teeny magnetic fields that are then generated between the temporal lobes, all right? And the pattern that's generated across will, after about 15 minutes, in the dark, with the eyes closed, produce experiences that are very similar to many, many mystical experiences. You don't need big, massive, intense fields. That's an interesting mentality. The idea the bigger the better. Nah, normally physiology doesn't work that way. So that's procedure, and of course this cannot be done without computers. The signaling, the information being sent through the solenoids, is thanks to the fact that computers have infinite possibilities of patterns. And in those patterns is information. And information does not have to be loud. It doesn't have to be ostentatious. It just has to be essential. Poets, writers, creative people, artists are remarkably sensitive to these magnetic fields and remarkably sensitive to mystical experiences. The same kind of experience that's associated with certain kinds of pharmacological agents, certain drugs, but there's no drugs here. This is simply the brain talking to itself. Think of it this way. If the brain is generating these experiences, and don't get into the philosophical argument that God created them and they have to be real, or does God exist, because it's really an irrelevant argument in this particular context. The critical thing is, if people will kill others because they think their mystical experience, their God experience was true, shouldn't we know the brain mechanisms responsible for that?
This is what we do all lab day.
Well, I'll tell you a secret. I never work. All this stuff is really enjoyable. I find nothing more exciting than lecturing and teaching and interacting. I enjoy writing and thinking and pushing the envelope. So basically, I never work. It's always quite enjoyable. Today's topic is going to be psychotropic drugs, a handful of them. And specifically, we want to investigate the nature of consciousness and what consciousness is and how it can be modified by drugs. Now, specifically those which have political and economic impact. Now, this is a very warm room. And if you want to remove all of your clothes in order to get into a situation that's receptacle or appropriate for this particular altered state, please feel free to do so. Now, first of all, what is a psychotropic drug? Basically, it's any compound, any chemical that imitates a neurotransmitter. A neurotransmitter is the chemistry by which neurons interact. And the reason psychotropic drugs work is because they imitate the functions of those transmitters, but they go beyond that such that they stimulate certain areas more than normal. For example, marijuana, THC. Where in the brain does it localize? It localizes within the frontal region. So one of the reasons you get the anxiolytic effects, that is the effects of reducing anxiety, is because you're stimulating the frontal lobe. But also it influences the hippocampus. So as a result, short-term memory is affected. Of course, you know how that works. Next time somebody is high as a kite on marijuana and they're talking prolifically with that elegant and fantastic language they use, stop them, distract them, and then ask them about 10 seconds later, what were you just saying? And they probably won't be able to tell you. Certainly not after 20 seconds. Marijuana also, if you have too much ingestion, will influence other areas. The parietal regions, for example. As a result, touch feels sensual. And consequently, very often, music may seem profound. And there's still an unresolved issue. If indeed you play that record back, do you really hear Paul is Dead? Now, that's for the older people in the group who've never heard of the Beatles, all right? If you have heard of them, you know what I mean. Now, other kinds of drugs, specifically such as STP, or DOME, which is a dimethylamphetamine, because it localizes within the amygdala, is often associated with aggression. So where the drug is, okay, and where it localizes within the brain will influence its impact on the person's experience. So I think the critical question is to ask, what the structure of the drug is in terms of its similarity to neurotransmitters, where in the brain it localizes, that is where it concentrates. And the third feature is effectively what are the dosages. Now, in terms of psychotropic drugs, I think it's important to realize that if we look at this great ravel knot, which is the human brain, and here we have a nice shot of it, we can see there's the frontal lobe, and of course if you influence the frontal lobe just a bit, you can get creativity. One of the reasons that people report creativity with marijuana is that this mild anxiolytic effect produces this kind of free association. But remember, all drugs influence maximally at small dosages, these kinds of drugs, and too much of a dosage can actually be an opposite effect, or produce an opposite effect. The temporal lobe is also involved. We look at the temporal lobe here. The temporal lobe is actually the locus for LSD effects. Most people don't know that. But if you remove the temporal lobe, there are no LSD effects. That in many respects, LSD experiences and most of the serotonin-based psychedelics work by producing a dreamlike state and involving the temporal lobe. And experiments have been shown that if you remove the temporal lobe, LSD just doesn't produce the experiences that occur in the normal person. So we have to know something about this great ravel knot, and I think the first thing we must know is that if we take a look at that brain, there it is, the white matter, sending information in and out of the gray area, which is the cortices. But for all practical purposes, consciousness is a closed loop. We have all this information going up into the cortex, but really, if we think at it quantitatively, only about 20% of the input to our cortex is sensory. All the rest of it is talk or interactions between those neurons, which means that consciousness is a closed loop, and sensory input is just a minor modification. Consciousness is actually created by this loop that is activated once every approximately 20 milliseconds with a phase modulation of about 12 milliseconds. That means if we change the neurochemistry within the cortices, we change the way you experience the world, we change your consciousness. So let's begin then with some of these classic ones in terms of understanding the kinds of images. Let's take a look at the consistent images associated with, here we go, mescaline, for example. Now, mescaline is actually a trimethoxy ethylamide, which means it's basically a compound very similar to dopamine. Remember what dopamine is. That's the one involved with all kinds of addictions. And there's a range of addictive capacities. Marijuana is not very addictive, LSD a bit more, and still some other drugs like opiates quite addictive, but only about 20% become addicted. So the point is that all of these various kinds of psychotropics, when you take them, go through various kinds of stages. Mescaline, so-called peyote, in stage 1, the typical experience is a grating or a lattice, cobweb shapes, a tunnel or a funnel or a cone, and a spiral. Of course, many conditions can produce this. Psychotropics can do it. In stage 2, we have meaningful images. Very meaningful images emerge. And these meaningful images can be very idiosyncratic. Then you have peoples, animals, and places. 60% to 70% of all people or all subjects report small animals or human figures that are friendly or caricature-like. Now, in some cultures, it may be called the totem, the spirit guide, the protectorate. And, of course, 70%, 72% report religious imagery. And that doesn't change that much with most of your famous psychotropic compounds. Now, I'm going to mention later that you don't have to have a chemical do this. The appropriately patterned magnetic field applied to the brain can also do this as well. In other words, you do not have to have a drug. Anything that changes brain activity, including these patterned fields we've been developing, can produce similar experiences. Well, let me give you some actual drawings. This is a drawing of a woman who was having a near-death experience. Now, very often near-death experiences are coupled with these psychotropic effects because hypoxia, alterations in cortical activity can actually produce something very similar. Here's a woman who was having a near-death experience. She suddenly felt all of these little things around her coming out of an iconic this case, it was